The sleigh careened sideways as another vicious gust hammered against its reinforced canvas cover, sending Clara Winthrop's gloved hands scrambling for purchase against the ice-slicked wooden bench. Snow whipped through Granitic Pass with a fury that seemed almost sentient, as if the mountains themselves conspired to devour all human trespassers. The temperature had plummeted 30 degrees in 2 hours, transforming what should have been a routine mail run into a fight for survival against the raw malevolence of a Rocky Mountain blizzard. Storm came up, like a knife-cold wall of wind. Old Pete Hawkins shouted over the howling wind, his weathered face barely visible beneath the ice-crusted brim of his felt hat. Frost clung to his gray whiskers like frozen tears, and each exhalation formed dense clouds immediately torn away by the gale. Should have turned back at Widow's Creek, but territorial mail waits for no man's comfort. Besides, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial rasp that barely carried over the wind. Been hearing troublesome whispers down in the valley settlements, talk of men disappearing who asked too many questions about the mining operations. Figured it's safer to push through than linger where unfriendly ears might be listening. Clara clutched the small tin reliquary beneath her woolen coat, feeling its familiar weight pressing against her ribs like a cold metallic heart. The ornate box contained more than mere tokens of grief. It held the final earthly connections between the living and the dead. Locks of silver hair tied with ribbon that had touched beloved faces, tarnished wedding rings, still warm with phantom touches, pressed wildflowers from mountain graves that marked dreams turned to dust, and tear-stained letters written in trembling hands that could no longer hold pen to paper. The work had found her during the darkest period of her life, when cholera swept through the Denver settlements like a merciless wave. Within 3 weeks, she had buried her parents, her younger brother Thomas, and her infant sister Mary, each death carving away another piece of her heart, until she wondered if anything remained worth preserving. Destitute and alone, she had accepted a desperate widow's plea to write proper words for her husband's grave marker, discovering an unexpected talent for translating raw grief into eloquent remembrance. Now, 3 years later, Clara had established herself as the territory's most sought-after grief scribe, traveling impossible distances to help families find voices for their sorrow. Yet the constant immersion in others' pain had left her emotionally cauterized, professionally compassionate, but personally hollow. She had learned to witness suffering without absorbing it, to offer comfort while maintaining protective distance from human attachment. Behind her, on the opposite bench, sat the other passenger, a man who had barely spoken since their departure from Granitic Pass that morning. He was unmistakably Lakota high cheekbones, carved from copper obsidian eyes that seemed to catalog every detail while revealing nothing, and an alertness that spoke of someone accustomed to reading danger in peripheral shadows. Yet he dressed in the practical manner of a working man, sturdy leather boots, worn smooth by honest labor wool trousers, expertly patched at stress points, and a thick buckskin coat that carried the distinctive aroma of wood smoke and pine resin. A wooden crate rested beside him, secured with meticulous care, using manila rope and waterproof oilcloth. When Pete had loaded it that bitter morning, Clara had observed the man's hands broad and scarred from years of precise work, yet gentle in their handling of whatever lay within that carefully protected container. There was something almost reverent in his touch, as if the crate held something far more precious than mere cargo. During the early hours of their journey, Clara had studied him with the professional discretion that came from years of reading human nature in moments of crisis. His posture suggested military training, the unconscious habit of positioning himself where he could observe all approaches, the economical movements that wasted no energy, the hyper-vigilant scanning of their surroundings that marked a man who had survived violence through preparedness rather than luck. The sleigh struck a hidden patch of black ice and began sliding inexorably toward the trail's edge, where the mountain dropped away into a canyon that disappeared into swirling whiteness. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she felt gravity claim them, pulling their modest conveyance toward what could only be certain death on the rocks far below. Pete's powerful arms strained against the leather reins as he fought to bring his 2 draft horses back under control. The animals were beyond panic now, their eyes rolling white with terror as they fought against traces that might as well have been gossamer threads in the face of the storm's overwhelming force. Ice had formed around their bits, making response to commands nearly impossible, and their hooves found no purchase on the treacherous surface. "Hold fast!" Pete bellowed, his voice cracking with strain and barely audible over the wind's demonic shriek. "This ain't the end I planned, but it might be the one we get." Without warning, the Lakota man moved with startling speed and sure instincts, reaching across the narrow space to brace Clara against the violent motion of the sliding sleigh. His grip was firm and steady, and for a brief moment their eyes met. His dark and alert, with practiced calm, hers wide with a kind of primal terror that strips away all pretense and social convention. In that instant of contact, she glimpsed something that penetrated her professional detachment, absolute reliability in the face of mortal crisis. Then the world exploded into chaos and spinning whiteness. The sleigh struck a massive drift, with the force of an artillery shell, the impact violent enough to shatter the wooden runners and launch all 3 passengers into the air in a deadly ballet of canvas, splintered wood, and driving snow. Clara felt herself spinning weightlessly through space, her hands instinctively protecting the precious reliquary as she crashed into something hard and unforgiving with bone-jarring force. Sharp agony shot through her left cheek where it struck a protruding boulder, and her wrist twisted beneath her with a sickening crack that sent lightning bolts of pain racing up her arm. Blood filled her mouth from where she had bitten her tongue, and for several heartbeats she couldn't draw breath, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except exist in a world of pure sensation and overwhelming hurt. Gradually, an eerie silence settled over the wreckage, broken only by the wind's continued assault on the mountain peaks. The terrible symphony of destruction had ended, replaced by the softer whisper of snow, continuing to fall on the debris of their brief, desperate journey. Clara lay motionless, taking careful inventory of her injuries, while fighting waves of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her fragile consciousness. "Miss, can you hear me?" The voice cut through her dazed state like a rope thrown to a drowning woman. She looked up through snow-crusted eyelashes to see the Lakota man kneeling beside her in the drift, his own face marked by a deep cut above his left eye that painted a thin red line down his temple. His buckskin coat hung in tatters from one shoulder, revealing darkly bruised skin beneath, and his breathing came in controlled but labored gasps that spoke of internal damage. "I believe I'm still among the living," Clara managed, though her voice sounded strange and distant in her own ears. She attempted to sit up and immediately regretted the decision as the world performed a sickening pirouette around her. "Easy," he said, placing a gentle but firm hand on her arm. Even through her thick coat, his touch radiated warmth and stability, anchoring her to consciousness when everything else seemed to be spinning away. "You've taken a severe blow to the head. We need to assess the damage before attempting to move." It was then that Clara's clearing vision fell upon old Pete, and her heart plummeted into an abyss of grief and terror. The male driver lay twisted at an impossible angle beside the overturned sleigh, his neck clearly broken by the violence of their impact. Snow was already beginning to shroud his still form, and his weathered hands that had guided horses through countless storms and safely delivered mail across impossible distances lay open and empty in the pristine white. "Is he?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer with heartbreaking certainty. The Lakota man moved to Pete's side with respectful solemnity, kneeling there for a long moment as he performed the grim ritual of confirming death. His examination was thorough but gentle, and when he finally looked back at Clara, his expression carried the weight of someone who had delivered such news too many times before. "He died instantly," he said with quiet dignity. The impact broke his neck cleanly. He felt no pain, suffered no fear in those final moments. Clara felt hot tears carve tracks down her frozen cheeks. Pete had been more than just a mail driver. He had been a bridge between isolated communities, a bearer of news both joyful and sorrowful. A man who understood that human connection was worth risking life and limb to preserve. He had often spoken fondly of his daughter Catherine in Sacramento, always planning to visit her come spring, when the mountain passes were navigable. Now that spring would arrive without him. "We need shelter immediately," the man said, rising to scan their surroundings with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating survival situations. "This storm is intensifying, and exposure will kill us as surely as any bullet if we remain in the open." Through the swirling curtain of snow, Clara could discern the dark outline of a substantial building, perhaps 70 yards up the slope. It appeared to be constructed in the territorial government style. Thick log walls, steep-pitched roof, designed to shed heavy snow, and small windows positioned to conserve heat while providing defensive observation points. "A telegraph station," she said, hope flickering in her chest, like a candle flame in the wind. The man followed her gaze and nodded with evident relief. Those mountain relay stations were engineered to withstand weather that would destroy lesser structures. "If we can reach it, we might survive until this storm passes." "What about your cargo?" Clara asked, noting how his eyes kept returning to the wooden crate despite their desperate circumstances. He paused in gathering scattered supplies, his expression growing distant with what might have been old pain, carefully contained. "It contains the remains of my younger brother," he said finally. He fell during the conflicts 2 years past, fighting alongside Crazy Horse at the Little Bighorn. "I've spent 3 years tracking down his bones, gathering the scattered pieces that the army left behind. He deserves to rest with our ancestors, not in some unmarked grave in hostile territory." The simple dignity of his words struck Clara like a physical blow. She had dedicated her life to helping families honor their dead, yet she had never encountered someone who would risk everything to reclaim a brother's bones from a battlefield. The courage and devotion required for such a quest spoke to depths of character she rarely encountered in her travels. "I'm Clara Winthrop," she said, extending her uninjured hand. "I write memorial letters for families who've lost someone precious." "Zoltana," he replied, clasping her hand with gentle firmness. "Most white folks call me Storm Rider. I work as a carpenter in Widow's Well building homes for families who need shelter more than they need money to pay for it." Understanding passed between them without need for further explanation. Both carried the weight of others' grief. He threw personal devotion to a fallen brother as she threw professional dedication to preserving memory. In that moment of recognition, Clara felt something shift in her carefully guarded heart, a crack in the protective ice she had built around her emotions. Together, they began the arduous journey through deepening drifts toward the distant station. The wind seemed determined to drive them back with every step, and more than once, Clara found herself leaning heavily against Zoltana's solid frame when her strength threatened to fail entirely. His knowledge of mountain terrain showed in the route he chose, avoiding the deepest drifts and most treacherous footing through an understanding of snow and wind that spoke of hard-won experience. "You know this country well," Clara observed during one of their brief rest stops. "I scouted for the cavalry before the treaties," he replied without breaking stride. "Learned to read weather signs and terrain features that mean the difference between life and death in country like this. Ironic that those skills now serve to keep me alive in the white man's world." There was no bitterness in his voice, but Clara detected an undercurrent of complex emotions that spoke to the difficult choices he had been forced to make. She understood something about impossible decisions. Her own career had been born from economic desperation, rather than calling shaped by circumstances that offered no comfortable alternatives. As they approached the telegraph station, Clara could see that it was indeed built in the substantial government style, with thick log walls chinked with moss and clay, and a stone chimney from which a thin wisp of smoke curled against the gray sky. The sight of that smoke sent hope racing through her frozen limbs. Where there was fire, there might be shelter, warmth, and perhaps even food. But the building appeared abandoned. Windows were boarded over with rough planks, and there were no signs of recent human habitation around the structure. The snow around the entrance was unmarked by footprints, suggesting that whoever had been maintaining that life-giving fire had not ventured outside in some time. Zoltana set down his precious cargo and approached the heavy wooden door with obvious caution. The portal was frozen shut, sealed by ice that had formed during previous storms and never properly thawed. He put his shoulder to the resistant wood and pushed his boots scraping against the ice-covered ground as he fought to gain entrance to what might be their salvation. The door finally yielded with a sharp crack that echoed across the mountainside, swinging inward to release a welcome rush of warm air. But that warmth carried more than the blessed scent of burning coal and wood smoke. It also bore something else. Something that triggered every primitive alarm in Clara's nervous system. A low, threatening growl echoed from the darkness beyond the doorway, followed by the soft but unmistakable sound of padded feet moving across wooden floors. Multiple pairs of yellow eyes gleamed in the shadows, like malevolent stars. Clara realized with a shock of pure terror that they were not the first living creatures to seek shelter at this abandoned outpost. A pack of wolves had claimed the building as their winter den, and they were distinctly uninclined to share their hard-won refuge with human intruders. Clara counted at least 5 pairs of those glowing orbs staring back at them from the interior gloom, though movement in the deeper shadows suggested additional pack members positioned throughout the station's rooms. Any rational person would have retreated immediately, sought shelter elsewhere, rather than challenging apex predators on their chosen ground. But the storm was intensifying, and there was nowhere else to run. Death by exposure was certain. Death by wolf attack was merely probable. Zoltana stepped protectively in front of Clara without hesitation, his hand moving toward the large knife that hung from his belt. But instead of drawing the weapon, he began to speak in what Clara assumed was Lakota low rhythmic words that seemed to flow like water over smooth stones. The sounds were unlike anything she had ever heard, musical and complex, with subtle tonal variations that suggested meanings far beyond her comprehension. "What are you doing?" Clara whispered urgently, her eyes never leaving those predatory orbs that continued to watch them with unblinking intensity. "Negotiating," he replied calmly. "They claimed this territory first, seeking shelter just as we are. Honor and respect demand acknowledgement of their prior claim. If I can convince them that we pose no threat to their pack or their food supply, they might be willing to share the space." Clara wanted to protest that this was no time for cultural niceties, that they needed decisive action before the pack decided to eliminate the human intrusion. Wolves were intelligent predators, and a pack this size could easily kill 2 injured humans if they perceived any threat to their dominance. But something in Zoltana's unwavering confidence stayed her urgent words. The largest wolf, a massive gray male with battle scars across his grizzled muzzle and shoulders, listened to Zoltana's words with tilted head and alert ears. For long, tense moments, the 2 species regarded each other in careful evaluation, predator recognizing predator across the species divide. The alpha's yellow eyes held intelligence and calculation, weighing factors that Clara could only guess at. Then, with deliberate dignity that spoke to some decision reached through criteria she couldn't fathom, the alpha turned and padded deeper into the station with measured steps. The other pack members followed his lead, and their eyes never completely leaving the humans, but their postures shifting from overtly threatening to merely watchful. "They've agreed to share," Zaltana explained with obvious relief, though his voice remained low and respectful. "But we're guests in their territory now. Move slowly, keep to the areas near the stove and front windows, and avoid the back rooms entirely. Those are their domain, and trespassing would be seen as a declaration of war." He retrieved his brother's remains and stepped carefully across the threshold, Clara following close behind, with her heart still hammering against her ribs. Once inside, Zaltana barred the door with a thick piece of timber that had clearly been used for that purpose many times before. The abandoned station suddenly felt less like salvation and more like a shared prison, but it was undeniably warmer than the killing storm outside. As her eyes adjusted to the dim interior light, Clara could make out the familiar remnants of the station's operational life. A telegraph key and receiving apparatus sat on a scarred wooden desk, their brass components dulled by neglect, but apparently still intact. Shelves lined the walls, holding leather-bound logbook supplies and the various tools of the telegrapher's trade. In one corner sat a narrow cot that showed signs of recent human occupancy, though the occupant was conspicuously absent. Someone was living here. Clara observed quietly, not wanting to disturb their lupine roommates with unnecessary noise. Zaltana nodded grimly, already moving to examine the coal scuttle beside the glowing pot-bellied stove. The station operator, most likely, probably died during the worst of the winter months when supply runs became impossible. The wolves moved in after the scent of death faded enough to make the space habitable. Clara suppressed a shudder at the thought of sharing quarters with both wild predators and the lingering presence of the unknown dead. But survival trumped comfort, and her immediate needs were pressing. Her wrist was swelling badly now, the pain growing more intense as the initial shock of the accident wore off. The cut on her cheek had begun to throb with a deep, persistent ache that suggested the beginning of infection if not properly treated. Using materials scavenged from around the station, a broken yardstick lengths of twine from the operator's desk, strips of cloth torn from an abandoned shirt, Zaltana quickly fashioned a serviceable splint for Clara's injured wrist. His touch was gentle, but supremely confident as he bound the makeshift brace in place, and Clara found herself studying his weathered face in the flickering light cast by the stove. He was older than she had initially estimated, probably in his mid-30s, with the kind of deep lines around his dark eyes that came from years of squinting into harsh weather and harsher circumstances. His hands bore the unmistakable scars and calluses of honest physical labor. And there was a steadiness about his entire presence that Clara found oddly comforting despite their dangerous and uncertain situation. From outside came a new sound that made both humans freeze in sudden alertness, the distant but unmistakable baying of hounds carried on the wind like a harbinger of fresh danger. The wolves in the back rooms stirred restlessly their own predator instincts, recognizing the approach of competing hunters. "Tracking dogs," Zaltana said grimly, moving to peer through gaps in the boarded windows. "Someone's following our trail despite weather that should make tracking impossible." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. But who would be out in conditions like this? What could be important enough to risk death in a blizzard? Before Zaltana could formulate a response, the telegraph apparatus on the desk began clicking with incoming signals, the brass key moving with mechanical precision as electrical impulses traveled through wire networks that somehow remained functional despite the storm. Clara moved to the device with growing hope. If the communication lines were still operational, they might be able to call for help from the territorial authorities. But the message that emerged from the clicking key made her blood congeal in her veins. "Storm Rider and Grief Woman, located at Relay Station 7. Retrieve all contents of metal container. Eliminate witnesses. Federal intervention impossible due to weather. Complete mission by dawn. Clara stared at the apparatus in shock and growing terror. Someone with access to the telegraph network knew exactly who they were, where they could be found, and what she carried in her professional kit. More disturbing still, the message suggested coordination between multiple parties. This wasn't the work of common criminals, but of an organized conspiracy with resources and reach far beyond anything she had imagined possible. They know everything about us? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that continued to assault the station's walls. Our names, our location, even what I'm carrying. How is that possible? Zoltana joined her at the desk, his expression darkening as he read the threatening message. Someone's been monitoring these communication lines, tracking our movements since before the accident occurred. This level of organization suggests involvement by territorial officials with access to government resources. The implications were staggering. If corrupt officials were using the telegraph network to coordinate criminal activities, then nowhere in the territory could be considered safe from their reach. The very systems designed to protect isolated communities had been turned into tools of oppression and murder. What exactly do you carry in that tin box? Zoltana asked, his voice low but urgent. Clara looked down at the reliquary, suddenly uncertain about contents she had transported for months without question. Personal mementos from grieving families, items entrusted to me during funeral services to be delivered to distant relatives or preserved as remembrances. Nothing that should matter to anyone else. But even as she spoke, Clara began to doubt her own words. The message they had intercepted proved that someone with significant resources considered her cargo worth risking lives in a blizzard to retrieve. Whatever she unknowingly carried had made her a target for forces that operated with frightening efficiency and ruthless determination. "Show me," Zoltana said quietly, his tone carrying both request and gentle command. With trembling fingers, Clara opened the tin reliquary and began spreading its contents across the telegraph operator's desk. Most items were exactly what she claimed: locks of hair, wedding rings, pressed flowers, small tintypes, and a few older daguerreotypes, handwritten letters from the bereaved. But nestled beneath these innocent tokens of grief, Zoltana's sharp eyes found something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a beaded charm worked in intricate blue and red patterns that told a complex story through geometric designs. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly Lakota work, but the specific pattern combination made Zoltana's hands shake as he lifted it with reverent care. "Where did you acquire this?" he asked, his voice thick with emotions he was struggling to control. "A woman gave it to me 3 weeks ago at a graveside service in Cinder Bluff," Clara replied, watching his reaction with growing concern. "She said her name was Mina, claimed to be a widow, who needed the charm carried to distant relatives for a memorial ceremony. I accepted it without close examination. Such requests are common in my line of work. This is my sister's handiwork." Zoltana said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Juania. But she was reported killed 6 months ago in a mining accident, along with her husband. The territorial authorities told our family that their bodies were unrecoverable, lost in a collapse that sealed off an entire section of the Cinder Bluff operation." Clara felt the world shift around her as understanding began to dawn. What if the reports were false? What if she survived and has been hiding using assumed names to avoid whoever wants her dead? From his own buckskin coat, Zoltana produced an identical charm, its patterns perfectly matching the one from Clara's collection. "A woman calling herself Mina approached me 4 days ago in Cinder Bluff. She pressed this into my hand and whispered that it would explain everything to the right person then disappeared into the crowd before I could ask questions. I've been carrying it ever since, hoping to find someone who could interpret its meaning. The pieces of a dangerous puzzle were falling into place with frightening clarity. The charms weren't random mementos, but specific coded messages carrying detailed information between family members who couldn't safely meet in person. Clara had been unknowingly recruited as a messenger in something far more dangerous than simple grief counseling. Wrapped around Clara's charm was a folded paper bearing the letterhead of the Cinder Bluff Mining Company. But when she unfolded it with careful fingers, both of them stared at what appeared to be payroll records showing systematic wage theft on a staggering scale. Workers were marked as paid for hours they hadn't worked, with a substantial difference being diverted to accounts controlled by Deputy Sheriff Abel Sykes and mine owner Harlan Dodd. But more disturbing still was a separate document fragment bearing an unfamiliar seal, the territorial governor's official letterhead, with a partial signature that made Clara's blood run cold. This conspiracy reached far beyond local corruption into the highest levels of territorial government. Look at this. Zoltana pointed to a series of dates and monetary figures that correlated with mining accidents reported in territorial newspapers. Every time an independent prospector gets close to exposing the wage theft, there's a convenient cave-in or equipment failure that eliminates the threat. This isn't random criminal activity, it's systematic murder disguised as industrial accidents. The sound of approaching hooves cut through their analysis like a blade through silk. Through gaps in the boarded windows, they could see armed riders surrounding the station. Despite the continuing blizzard, their movements coordinated with military precision. These weren't desperate men seeking shelter, they were professional killers who had tracked their quarry through impossible weather to complete a mission that apparently couldn't wait for better conditions. "We know you're in there," came a shout from outside the voice, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is Deputy Sheriff Abel Sykes, acting under territorial authority. You're harboring stolen government property and interfering with official business. Come out immediately, and we might consider letting you live long enough to explain your crimes." Clara recognized the name with a chill of absolute terror. Sykes had been mentioned in several of the documents they had just examined, his signature appearing on falsified records that documented years of systematic theft from working families. If he was personally leading this pursuit through a potentially deadly blizzard, it meant the stakes were far higher than simple local corruption. But something in his words caught her attention. Stolen government property, rather than evidence of criminal activity. The distinction suggested that whatever she carried was officially classified, that her possession of it constituted a federal crime, regardless of how she had acquired it. The conspiracy wasn't just using government resources. It was operating under color of law, protected by official classifications that made exposure tantamount to treason. "The back room," Zoltana said urgently, gathering the most crucial documents, while leaving the innocent mementos scattered across the desk. "There has to be an alternate exit. Mountain stations always have emergency egress in case of fire or hostile attack." They moved through the main room with careful steps, mindful of their lupine roommates who watched from the shadows with predatory alertness. The wolves seemed to understand that new dangers threatened their temporary haven, their ears pricked forward and muscles tensed for whatever violence might erupt around them. Behind them, they could hear Sykes's men beginning their assault on the station's defenses, axes biting into solid oak with methodical determination. But the door was built to withstand Indian attacks and mountain weather. It would hold for precious minutes before yielding to sustained assault. In the station's rear chamber, Clara discovered what they desperately needed, a narrow window that opened onto the building's back wall, facing away from where the attackers had positioned themselves. The opening was small and positioned uncomfortably high, but it was large enough for determined people to squeeze through if they were willing to risk the drop to the snow-covered ground below. But as Zoltana boosted Clara toward the window, both of them heard something that turned their blood to ice water. The sound of the front door finally splintering under repeated blows, followed by Sykes's voice raised in furious command. Find that reliquary. Every scrap of paper, every piece of evidence. And kill anyone who's seen the contents we can't afford witnesses at this level of the operation. Clara struggled through the narrow window opening, fighting against her heavy winter clothing and injured wrist, while Zoltana provided steady support from below. As she finally squeezed through and dropped into the deep snow behind the station, she could hear chaos erupting inside as armed men encountered the wolf pack that had been claiming the building as territory. Snarls and gunshots echoed through the thin walls, followed by human screams and the crash of overturning furniture. The wolves defending their claimed space against sudden invasion had turned the simple search and destroy mission into a battle for survival that no one had anticipated. Zoltana landed beside Clara, in the drift his movements controlled despite the urgency of their escape. Behind them, the sounds of violence continued as man and beast fought for dominance in the confined space of the station. But they couldn't depend on that distraction. Lasting long professional killers would adapt quickly to unexpected obstacles. Which direction? Clara gasped, struggling to orient herself in the swirling whiteness that surrounded them on all sides. Zoltana pointed toward a dark line of trees that marked the forest edge, barely visible through the storm. The old mining trail leads down through the timber to Cinder Bluff. If Wanya is hiding where I think she is, we'll find her there. But we need to move fast. They'll organize pursuit as soon as they finish dealing with the wolves. They began their desperate flight through the deepening snow, carrying evidence that could expose corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. But Clara knew their troubles were far from over. Sykes commanded enough resources to hunt them across the entire territory, and the conspiracy they had stumbled into was clearly worth any number of lives to protect. As they disappeared into the forest, with the sounds of battle fading behind them, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were entering a larger and deadlier game, where the stakes were far higher than she had ever imagined. The tin reliquary that had seemed so innocent now felt like it carried the weight of the territory's future, and the burden of secrets that powerful men would kill to keep buried in the mountain snow. The descent through the mountain forest became a race against time and the elements, each step a calculated gamble between speed and safety. Clara's fractured wrist sent continuous lightning bolts of agony up her arm with every jarring movement, and the cut on her cheek had begun to throb with a deep, insistent ache that warned of impending infection. But Zoltana's steady presence and sure guidance kept her moving when her body screamed for rest. Behind them, the baying of tracking dogs grew steadily more distinct, accompanied by the crash of men forcing their way through the underbrush, with the single-minded determination of professional hunters. Sykes had recovered from the wolf attack more quickly than they had hoped, organizing pursuit with military efficiency, despite the casualties his men had undoubtedly suffered. "Tell me about the beadwork," Clara said during one of their brief rest stops, partly to distract herself from the pain, and partly because she needed to understand what they were walking into. How do the patterns carry messages? Zoltana showed her the intricate designs on his charm, tracing the geometric elements with gentle fingers that seemed to find meaning in every curve and angle. Each symbol represents concepts that can be combined to create complex communications. This blue ladder pattern means meet at the place of childhood memories. Or the red triangle warns of great danger following close behind. The white circle in the center indicates family bond stronger than death. Together, they told me that Wanya was alive, hiding somewhere connected to our past, and that approaching her would put all of us at mortal risk. They resumed their difficult journey with Zoltana demonstrating remarkable skill in choosing a route through the worst of the terrain. He had fashioned crude but effective snowshoes from pine branches and strips of leather, and his knowledge of mountain geography was encyclopedic. He seemed to know every game trail, every natural shelter, every shortcut that might give them precious minutes of advantage over their pursuers. "You learned this during the wars," Clara observed, noting how he read signs in the landscape that were invisible to her untrained eyes. "I scouted for both sides at different times," he replied with matter-of-fact honesty that surprised her. Survival meant understanding that loyalty was a luxury men like me couldn't afford. I fed information to the cavalry when it served my people's interests, and I guided war parties when it didn't. The officers called it treachery, but I called it doing whatever was necessary to keep my family alive. There was no shame in his voice, but Clara detected the weight of difficult choices that had left permanent scars on his conscience. She understood something about impossible decisions. Her own career had been built on a foundation of economic desperation and emotional compromise shaped by circumstances that offered no comfortable alternatives. The sound of barking dogs grew noticeably closer, now accompanied by human voices that carried clearly through the thin mountain air. Clara could make out individual commands being shouted between the searchers, their coordination speaking to professional training and extensive experience in manhunts across difficult terrain. "How much farther to where you think your sister is hiding?" Clara asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to hear the honest answer. "Perhaps 3 miles to the abandoned copper workings," Zaltana replied, checking the sky for any signs that the storm might be weakening. "But they're closing the distance faster than I hoped. Those dogs can follow our scent trail, even in snow this heavy, and Sykes has men who know this country nearly as well as I do." They pushed themselves harder, half running through the forest, when the terrain allowed fighting through drifts that sometimes reached above Clara's waist. Her lungs burned from the effort of breathing the thin, icy air, and her injured wrist had begun to swell so badly that the improvised splint was cutting off circulation to her fingers. But the alternative to continued movement was capture by men who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their conspiracy. The documents they carried could expose corruption that reached into the territorial governor's office, revealing a systematic campaign of theft and violence that had claimed dozens of lives over the past several years. The entrance to the old copper mine appeared ahead of them, like a wound carved into the mountainside, partially concealed by a rock fall that had occurred during the final days of the mining operation. The opening was just large enough for a person to squeeze through, but the interior disappeared into absolute darkness that could hide anything. "Wanya," Zaltana called softly as they approached the ominous entrance, his voice carefully modulated to carry into the tunnels without alerting their distant pursuers. "It's Stormrider, your brother. Are you here? Are you safe?" For several heartbeats that seemed to stretch into hours, there was no response, except the echo of his voice disappearing into the network of abandoned passages. Then from somewhere deep within the mountain's dark interior came the blessed sound of movement and a woman's voice, cautious but filled with unmistakable hope and desperate relief. "Brother, is it truly you? I had begun to fear that my messages never reached anyone who could understand them." The reunion between Zaltana and his sister was necessarily brief but intensely emotional. Wanya emerged from the mine's depths, carrying a small oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, her face gaunt from months of inadequate nutrition, but her dark eyes bright with joy at seeing her brother alive. Behind her came 2 surprises. Clara hadn't expected: a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, and an elderly man who moved with the careful steps of someone nursing serious injuries. "This is Hugh," Wanya explained, placing a protective hand on the boy's thin shoulder. His father worked at Dodd's mill until he discovered the payroll fraud and started asking uncomfortable questions. Hugh has been living with me since his father was murdered. She gestured to the older man. And this is Samuel Briggs, the telegraph operator from Cinder Bluff. He was supposed to die in a staged accident, but managed to escape with evidence that proves the conspiracy reaches all the way to the territorial governor's office. Clara's mind reeled at the implications. If a government telegraph operator had evidence of corruption at the highest levels, then the conspiracy was far more extensive and dangerous than anything she had imagined. They weren't just fighting local criminals. They were challenging a network of corruption that controlled the entire territorial administration. "We don't have much time," Zoltana said urgently, the sounds of approaching dogs now clearly audible even from within the mine entrance. "Sykes is tracking us with hounds, and they'll be here within minutes. We need to find a way out of this mountain that doesn't lead us directly back into their hands." Wania nodded with grim understanding, her expression hardening with the kind of resolve that comes from months of living in constant fear. "Then it's time to end this nightmare once and for all. Samuel has been helping me compile evidence that will bring down the entire network. But we needed someone who could get it to honest federal authorities." Samuel Briggs stepped forward, his weathered face marked by the kind of determination that had kept him alive through months of hiding and hardship. "I've been intercepting telegraph messages between Sykes Dodd and their contacts in the territorial capital. The conspiracy involves systematic murder, land fraud, and theft of federal mining revenues on a scale that would shock the entire nation if it ever became public knowledge." Hugh led them deeper into the mine's labyrinthine tunnel system, his small lamp casting eerie shadows on walls that seemed to press in around them with claustrophobic intensity. The passages formed a complex maze of interconnected chambers and corridors, some ending abruptly in cave-ins, while others stretched away into darkness that swallowed their feeble light. In a small chamber that had once served as a storage area for mining equipment, Hugh showed them a loose stone in the wall that appeared identical to dozens of others. Behind this carefully disguised hiding place was a wrapped bundle containing documents that made Clara's heart race when she realized their true significance. The papers were extensive and damning beyond anything she had imagined possible. Complete telegraph transcripts showing coordination between territorial officials and local criminals. Detailed financial records proving systematic theft of federal mining revenues. Most shocking of all, a series of death warrants disguised as accident reports signed by Territorial Governor Marcus Whitmore himself. They've been operating with complete impunity for over 3 years. Briggs explained, his voice heavy with disgust and anger. Every independent prospector who got close to exposing the theft ended up dead in a convenient accident. Every telegraph operator who intercepted suspicious messages was transferred to remote stations and then eliminated. They've murdered at least 30 people that I can document, and probably twice that number whose deaths were never properly investigated. The most horrifying document was a recent telegram from Governor Whitmore to an unknown recipient. "Federal investigation imminent. Initiate final protocol. Eliminate all witnesses and evidence. Territorial autonomy must be preserved at any cost." Federal investigation. Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "President Hayes has been receiving reports about irregularities in territorial mining revenues," Briggs replied. "He's planning to send federal marshals to conduct a comprehensive audit of the entire operation. If that investigation proceeds, it will expose corruption that reaches into Congress itself." The sound of barking dogs echoed from the mine entrance, much closer now, and accompanied by the harsh voices of men who had finally tracked them to their hiding place. Sykes' search party had found their refuge, and the final confrontation was about to begin. "We know you're in there," came Sykes' voice, magnified and distorted by the tunnel acoustics. "This is your last chance to surrender peacefully. Come out with your hands visible, and we might consider letting some of you live long enough to see a trial." But Clara could hear the lie in his words. Men who had committed murder on this scale couldn't afford to leave witnesses alive, regardless of what promises they made. Their only hope lay in finding another way out of the mountain before Sykes's men could force their way through the narrow passages to reach them. "There's another exit," Hugh said quietly, tugging at Clara's sleeve with the urgency of a child who understood that adult problems could be matters of life and death. "But it's dangerous, and most grown-ups are too big to fit through the passage easily." The boy led them to what appeared to be a dead end at the chamber's rear wall. But closer inspection revealed a narrow crack in the living rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. Air moved through the opening with noticeable force, suggesting it led to the surface somewhere above their current location, though the route was clearly treacherous and potentially deadly. "It comes out near the old stamp mill ruins," Hugh explained in a whisper. "But the rocks are loose throughout the passage, and it's a long climb in complete darkness. People bigger than me sometimes get stuck partway up." They had no choice. One by one, they squeezed through the crack into a natural chimney that rose through the mountain's interior like a stone throat designed to swallow the unwary. The ascent was treacherous beyond anything Clara had imagined, with loose stones threatening to cascade down on their heads, with every movement in sections so narrow that she feared she might become permanently wedged between the unforgiving walls. Her fractured wrist screamed with agony as she climbed each grip, sending bolts of lightning up her arm. But desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Above her, she could hear Wanya encouraging Hugh through particularly narrow sections, while below Zoltana and Briggs brought up the rear, ready to catch anyone who might lose their grip on the treacherous stone. Behind them, echoing up through the rock chimney, like the voices of demons, they could hear Sykes's furious shouts as he discovered the hidden chamber and realized that his carefully planned trap had been circumvented once again by the quick thinking and local knowledge of a determined child. They emerged at the old stamp mill ruins as dawn was breaking over the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost peaceful after the horror of their underground ordeal. The skeletal remains of the mining operation stood before them like monuments to failed dreams and abandoned hopes. But they also provided perfect cover for what Clara suddenly realized would have to be their final stand, because their spread out in the valley below them was in sight that made her heart sink with despair. Sykes hadn't just brought a small search party he had assembled, what appeared to be a small army of at least 50 mounted men positioned throughout Cinder Bluff with military precision. The entire town was under occupation, with armed guards at every building and checkpoint controlling all routes in and out of the settlement. "They're not just trying to eliminate witnesses," Clara said with growing understanding. "They're preparing for the federal investigation. This is a military operation designed to control the entire territory." Samuel Briggs nodded grimly. "Whitmore has activated the territorial militia under emergency powers, claiming that federal interference threatens local autonomy. He's essentially declared independence from Washington, and he has the military force to make it stick, at least temporarily." The implications were staggering. What had begun as local corruption had escalated into open rebellion against federal authority, with the conspirators willing to commit treason rather than face justice for their crimes. They weren't just fighting criminals anymore. They were facing an organized military force that controlled the entire territorial government. But as Clara studied the forces arrayed against them, she noticed something that gave her a glimmer of hope. In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, she could see smoke rising from the railroad tracks that connected Cinder Bluff to the main transportation network. It was the wrong time of day for a scheduled freight run, which meant it was probably the federal investigation team that Whitmore was so desperate to prevent from reaching the mining district. "The federal marshals," she said with growing excitement. "They're already here and Sykes doesn't know it yet." The final battle was about to begin, but for the first time since their ordeal started, Clara began to believe they might actually have a chance of surviving to see justice done. The evidence they carried could expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of government, but only if they could live long enough to deliver it to honest authorities. As Sykes's forces began moving up the mountain toward their position, Clara realized that everything they had endured, the blizzard, the wolves, the desperate flight through the forest, had been preparation for this moment. The fate of the entire territory would be decided in the next few hours, and she and her unlikely companions were the only people who could ensure that justice prevailed over corruption and murder. The ore cart railway that Hugh had mentioned stretched down the mountainside like a steel lifeline, offering their only realistic chance of reaching the federal forces before Sykes could eliminate them and destroy the evidence they carried. It was a desperate gamble that would either deliver them to safety or kill them in a spectacular crash, but it was the only option that offered any hope of survival. As Clara climbed into the rusted ore cart alongside Zaltana Hugh and Samuel Briggs, she reflected on how much her life had changed since boarding Pete's mail sleigh just 2 days earlier. She was no longer just a grief scribe who documented other people's losses. She had become an active participant in the fight for justice, carrying evidence that could reshape the future of the American West. The ancient brake wheel screeched in protest as Zaltana released it with careful precision, and the cart began to roll forward on rails that gleamed in the morning sunlight. Behind them, shouts of alarm echoed across the mountainside as Sykes realized what they were attempting and understood that his carefully orchestrated conspiracy was about to be exposed to the world. But it was too late to stop them now. Gravity had claimed its due, and they were racing down the mountain toward whatever fate awaited them in the valley below, carrying with them the power to bring down one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in American history. The runaway descent began with deceptive gentleness, the cart rolling forward with increasing momentum as gravity overcame the resistance of corroded wheels and neglected rails. But within moments, their leisurely departure transformed into a terrifying plunge down the mountainside that tested every ounce of courage Clara possessed. The cart gathered speed with frightening swiftness, its ancient metal wheels shrieking against rails that hadn't seen proper maintenance in over a decade. Wind tore at Clara's hair and clothes as they accelerated beyond any reasonable speed for the primitive track. And she could feel her stomach dropping with each dip and curve in their desperate route to the valley floor. Beside her, Hugh whooped with wild exhilaration that only a child could manage in such circumstances, while Wanya held him protectively with arms that trembled from more than just the cart's violent motion. Samuel Briggs gripped the evidence bundles with white knuckles, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination, as he prepared to sacrifice his life to ensure the documents reached federal authorities. Zaltana crouched at the front of the cart, his experienced hands working the primitive brake system with desperate precision as he fought to maintain some semblance of control over their descent. But the brakes were corroded and unreliable, their metal components ground down by years of weather and neglect, offering only token resistance to the relentless forces that pulled them ever faster down the mountain. "Bridge ahead," Zaltana shouted over the roar of wind and grinding metal, his voice barely audible above the mechanical symphony of their runaway flight. Clara looked up to see a wooden trestle spanning a deep ravine, its support beams weathered gray by mountain storms and sagging under the accumulated weight of countless winters. The structure looked barely capable of supporting its own mass, let alone an ore cart loaded with 5 desperate passengers traveling at what felt like suicidal velocity. "Can we slow down in time?" Wanya called her voice tight with controlled terror as she calculated the chances of their survival. Too late, Zoltana replied, throwing his full weight against the brake mechanism in a final attempt to reduce their speed. Sparks flew from the wheels in brilliant cascades as metal scraped against metal, but their velocity barely decreased. The cart hit the bridge at nearly full speed, sending violent vibrations through the ancient timber structure that Clara could feel resonating in her bones. Boards cracked and groaned under the tremendous strain, and she could see gaps opening between support beams as the entire trestle began to flex and separate under forces it was never designed to handle. Then disaster struck with terrifying suddenness. A crucial support beam weakened by decades of weather and neglect gave way beneath them with a sharp crack that sounded like a rifle shot. The entire left side of the bridge began collapsing in slow motion, the rails twisting and separating as tons of timber plummeted into the rocky canyon below. Time seemed to slow as Clara watched certain death approaching. The cart tilted sickeningly as the track beneath them disintegrated, throwing them toward the edge of the ravine where jagged boulders waited hundreds of feet below. She could see individual stones and twisted pine trees growing from the cliff face, could hear Wania's sharp intake of breath and Hugh's sudden silence, as they all realized that their desperate gamble was about to end in catastrophic failure. But Zoltana moved with lightning reflexes, born of desperation and battlefield experience. As the cart tilted past the point of no return, he abandoned the useless brake system and grabbed the cart's frame using his body weight and considerable strength to shift their center of gravity at the critical moment. The violent maneuver threw all of them to the right side of the cart, just as it reached a section of bridge that remained intact. They slammed back onto solid rails with bone-jarring force that drove Clara's teeth together with an audible click and sent stars dancing across her vision. But they were alive and still moving, racing away from the collapsing bridge as sections of it tumbled into the ravine behind them with thunderous crashes that echoed off the canyon walls. "Is everyone still with us?" Zoltana called back, blood trickling from where he had bitten his tongue during the violent maneuver. "Still here." Clara gasped, amazed to find herself breathing and conscious after what should have been certain death. Her respect for Zoltana's quick thinking and decisive action grew even deeper in the space of heartbeats. He had assessed their desperate situation and made the split-second decision that saved all their lives. But their ordeal was far from over. The rails ahead curved sharply to the left, following the natural contours of the mountainside in a turn that had been engineered for slow-moving ore cars, not high-speed escapes. The physics of their situation were becoming increasingly unfavorable. Too much speed, too little control, and terrain that demanded precision navigation they simply couldn't achieve. Zoltana fought the brake system again, sending another shower of sparks flying from the wheels as he desperately tried to reduce their velocity before the curve. But the metal components were heating up from friction, beginning to glow cherry red in places, and Clara could smell burning steel mixing with the pine-scented mountain air. The cart tilted dangerously as they hit the curve, two wheels actually lifting completely from the rails for a heart-stopping moment before crashing back down with tremendous force. Clara felt her bones rattle from the impact, and she tasted blood where she had bitten her tongue, but somehow their improvised vehicle held together under stresses that should have torn it apart. Behind them, she could hear the pursuit continuing despite their seemingly impossible speed. Horses galloping at dangerous velocity as Sykes's men tried to keep pace with the runaway cart, their riders shouting commands and coordinates as they attempted to intercept the fugitives at some point further down the mountain. But the advantage was shifting in favor of the escapees now. Horses couldn't maintain this punishing pace much longer in the thin mountain air, while gravity would carry the cart all the way to the valley floor regardless of mechanical failures or human endurance. If they could survive the descent without derailing, they might actually reach the federal forces before Sykes could organize effective opposition. There, Hugh pointed ahead with excitement, his young eyes sharper than those of the adults around him. The switching yard. Clara could see their immediate destination, now a complex of buildings and machinery clustered around the point where the mining railway connected to the main railroad line. But her heart sank when she spotted armed men positioned around the structures, clearly waiting to intercept them with overwhelming firepower. Sykes had anticipated their route and stationed his remaining forces at the bottom of the mountain, turning what should have been their salvation into another carefully prepared death trap. Even if they survived the harrowing descent, they would be racing directly into the guns of men who had orders to kill them and destroy the evidence they carried. "We're heading straight into an ambush," Clara said, her voice barely audible over the mechanical roar of their descent. But Hugh was already thinking ahead with the kind of quick intelligence that had kept him alive through months of hiding and constant danger. "The switching yard has multiple track junctions." He called out, his voice bright with sudden inspiration. "If we can hit the right switch controls, we can divert onto the railroad depot line instead of the processing plant track." Clara saw the brilliance of his plan immediately. Instead of racing into Sykes's waiting guns at the processing facility, they could potentially switch tracks and aim for the railroad depot where federal marshals were presumably establishing their headquarters. It was still incredibly dangerous, but it offered their only realistic chance of reaching honest law enforcement before corrupt territorial forces could eliminate them. "Can you reach the switch mechanism in time?" Zoltana asked, his voice tight with concern for the boys' safety as well as their collective survival. Hugh nodded with the kind of confidence that comes from intimate familiarity with dangerous places. "I know every switch and junction in this entire system. But I'll have to jump from the moving cart onto the control platform." As they approached the switching complex at what felt like terminal velocity, Hugh prepared for his death-defying leap. The wooden platform beside the track junction was narrow and rough, offering little margin for error in what would essentially be a controlled crash landing. One misstep would mean death or crippling injury, but failure to make the attempt would doom all of them to certain death in Sykes's ambush. "Now," Zoltana shouted at precisely the right moment, his timing based on calculations that had no room for error. Hugh jumped with the natural grace and fearlessness of childhood, his small body arcing through the air before landing hard on the wooden platform with an impact that made Clara's heart stop. The boy rolled and tumbled from the collision, his momentum carrying him dangerously close to the platform's edge. And for a terrible moment, Clara was certain he had been killed or seriously injured. But Hugh bounced to his feet with the amazing resilience of youth and ran immediately to the manual switch lever, throwing his entire weight against the heavy iron mechanism that controlled the track junction. The lever had been corroded in place by years of mountain weather, and Clara could see the boy straining against metal that seemed determined to resist his efforts. The rails began to shift just as their cart approached the crucial decision point, and the switch mechanism groaning in protest as Hugh's determination overcame years of neglect and mechanical resistance. Clara held her breath as their speeding vehicle approached the junction, knowing that their survival depended entirely on the timing of a brave child and the reliability of equipment that hadn't been properly maintained in over a decade. The transition was violent and chaotic, throwing all of them against the side of the cart as the wheels hit the switch points with tremendous force, and a shower of sparks that lit up the morning air like fireworks. For a moment that seemed to last forever. Clara was certain they would derail completely and be killed in the resulting crash. But somehow their battered conveyance held together under impossible stresses, and they found themselves racing down a different set of rails toward the railroad depot instead of the processing plant where Sykes's ambush waited. Behind them, the corrupt deputy sheriff's furious shouts echoed across the valley as he realized that his carefully orchestrated trap had been circumvented once again by the quick thinking and desperate courage of a determined child. The depot appeared ahead of them like a promise of salvation, a substantial wooden building with a loading platform where morning freight trains typically loaded and unloaded cargo destined for distant cities. Clara could see uniformed figures moving around a locomotive that bore the distinctive markings of federal law enforcement marshals and possibly army troops who had arrived to investigate the mining district's irregularities. But their cart was still moving dangerously fast, and the rails ended at a massive wooden bumper designed to halt fully loaded ore cars traveling at normal speeds. The impact would be catastrophic unless they could find some way to reduce their velocity in the final seconds before collision. The water tower. Wania pointed to a tall wooden structure beside the tracks, its support legs positioned close enough to the rails that they might be able to use it as an anchor point. Zaltana understood immediately. He stripped off his thick leather belt and prepared to throw it toward the tower's support structure as they raced past, hoping to create enough drag to slow their approach to survivable speed. It was a desperate measure with a very low probability of success, but it was the only option that offered any hope of surviving the final moments of their harrowing descent. The improvised anchor caught on a protruding beam with enough force to nearly pull Zaltana from the cart entirely, the leather strap stretching and groaning under tremendous tension. But the desperate maneuver worked just enough to reduce their speed from instantly fatal to merely catastrophic, giving them a slim chance of surviving the impact with the massive timber barrier that marked the end of their wild ride. They hit the wooden bumper with tremendous force, but slowly enough that the collision was survivable rather than immediately lethal. The cart crumpled against the barrier like an accordion, throwing its passengers forward in a tangled mass of arms and legs and scattered evidence. Clara felt her fractured wrist explode with fresh agony, and stars danced before her eyes as her head struck the cart's metal frame, but she remained conscious and breathing. Somehow, impossibly, they had survived. They were battered, bleeding, and barely conscious, but they had reached their destination with the evidence that could expose one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in American territorial history. Federal Marshal Thompson, Denver District. A uniformed man announced approaching their wrecked cart with obvious concern and professional interest. His badge gleamed in the morning sunlight, and his bearing suggested competence and integrity that Clara hadn't dared hope to find. "We received intelligence about corruption in the territorial administration. Are these the documents mentioned in the reports we've been receiving?" Clara nodded weakly, unwrapping the precious papers with hands that shook from exhaustion and pain. "Everything's here." She managed her voice hoarse from shouting over the wind during their descent. Payroll fraud, systematic murder, territorial officials conspiring against federal authority, enough evidence to bring down the entire network and restore legitimate government to this region. But even as she spoke the words that should have marked the end of their ordeal, Clara could hear the thunder of approaching hooves echoing across the depot yard. Sykes and his remaining forces were making one final desperate charge, riding hard, with weapons drawn in broad daylight, apparently willing to attack federal law enforcement officers rather than allow the evidence to reach Washington. "Take defensive positions," Marshal Thompson shouted, drawing his service revolver as armed riders poured into the depot area with obvious intent to kill everyone present. "We're under attack by hostile territorial forces." The final battle was about to begin, and Clara found herself at the center of a gunfight that would determine whether justice or corruption would control the future of the American frontier. The evidence was finally in the hands of honest federal authorities, but Sykes was prepared to commit open acts of war against the United States government rather than face the consequences of his crimes. Gunfire erupted across the railroad depot with the sudden, overwhelming violence of a summer thunderstorm transforming the peaceful morning into a battlefield, where the future of territorial justice would be decided through force of arms. Clara dove behind a stack of wooden freight crates clutching the evidence documents as bullets splintered the timber around her with vicious precision that spoke to professional marksmanship and deadly intent. The acrid smell of gun smoke filled the morning air, mixing with the scent of coal smoke from the locomotive, and the metallic tang of blood from men who had already paid the price for standing in the path of corruption's final desperate gambit. She could hear men shouting orders and curses as the battle raged, with an intensity that suggested neither side expected to take prisoners. Marshal Thompson and his fellow federal officers had taken defensive positions behind the locomotive's massive iron bulk, using its impenetrable mass as cover, while they returned fire with a disciplined precision that came from extensive training and combat experience. Their superior positioning and professional expertise gave them a significant tactical advantage. But Sykes commanded more men and possessed the reckless determination that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. Surrender now, and some of you might live to see proper trials. Thompson called out during a brief lull in the shooting, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, backed by military force. Sykes's response was another volley of gunfire that shattered depot windows and sent wooden splinters flying from the loading platform like deadly rain. Clara could see him positioned behind an overturned freight wagon, his face twisted with the kind of rage that comes from watching years of careful planning collapse in a matter of hours. But what made the situation truly terrifying was the realization that Sykes wasn't just fighting to escape justice. He was fighting to prevent the exposure of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial and possibly federal government. The documents Clara had risked her life to preserve contained evidence of treason, systematic murder, and corruption on a scale that would shock the entire nation if it became public knowledge. Zaltana had taken cover near Clara's position, his steady hands working with practiced efficiency as he reloaded the revolver that Marshal Thompson had pressed into his grasp during the initial chaos. Despite the bullets flying around them and the very real possibility of death, he remained calm and focused, making every shot count as he helped defend the evidence that could finally bring justice to the frontier territories. A bullet whined past Clara's ear with a sound like an angry wasp, so close she could feel its heat against her skin. She pressed herself lower behind the crates, her fractured wrist throbbing with every heartbeat, and her vision still blurred from the head injury she had sustained during their cart crash. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had survived a blizzard wolf attack, mine collapse, and runaway ore cart descent, only to face death in a gunfight at what should have been the moment of their salvation. "Where are the others?" she called to Zaltana during a momentary pause in the shooting. "Juania and Hugh are safe inside the depot with Samuel Briggs," he replied, snapping his revolver's cylinder closed with a decisive click. "The station master is hiding them in his office while the battle rages out here." The station master, a gray-haired man named Patrick Kelly, had shown remarkable courage in protecting the sister-orphaned boy and wounded telegraph operator despite the obvious danger. Clara had seen him earlier, calmly herding them to safety, while bullets shattered windows around the platform, proving that heroism wasn't limited to those who wore badges or carried weapons. A new sound cut through the battle, the shrill whistle of multiple approaching trains echoing across the valley with mechanical authority that spoke to federal power finally arriving in force. Clara looked up to see not one, but 3 locomotives charging down the main line toward the depot, their smokestacks belching black coal smoke against the morning sky like battle flags. "Federal reinforcements," Thompson shouted with obvious relief and satisfaction. "Army troops from Fort Collins, plus additional federal marshals from the Denver district. We've got them outnumbered now." The sight of overwhelming federal forces arriving by special train had an immediate and dramatic effect on what remained of Sykes's demoralized force. Several of his men began backing away from the fight, clearly unwilling to face impossible odds in a battle they couldn't possibly win. These were hired guns and corrupt local officials, not professional soldiers trained to fight hopeless battles for abstract principles. But Sykes himself seemed to have moved beyond rational thought or self-preservation, continuing to fire wildly as the trap closed around him with mathematical certainty. His years of corruption and systematic murder had finally caught up with him. But rather than face justice for his crimes, he appeared determined to take as many people with him as possible, in a final act of spiteful violence. "Cutter!" Sykes screamed to his foreman over the noise of gunfire and approaching reinforcements. "Burn the depot. Destroy those documents before the federal bastards can use them against us." Jed Cutter responded to this desperate order by pulling a bottle of kerosene from his saddlebags and hurling it against the depot's dry wooden walls with vicious determination. The container shattered on impact, spreading flammable liquid across the building's weathered timber in a pattern that would ensure rapid combustion and total destruction. A moment later, he threw a burning rag after the kerosene, and flames began climbing the depot's exterior with frightening speed, threatening to consume not only the building, but also the innocent people hidden inside. Clara watched in horror as fire spread across the structure where Wanya Hugh and Samuel Briggs were sheltering from the gun battle, their lives now threatened by both bullets and the growing conflagration. Without stopping to consider the consequences or her own safety, Clara broke from her defensive position and ran toward the burning building, ignoring the bullets that whined past her head, like metallic insects seeking flesh. Behind her, she could hear Zaltana shouting her name with desperate concern. But she was focused entirely on reaching the depot before the fire could trap the people inside. The interior of the building was already filling with thick, choking smoke as Clara burst through the front door, her injured wrist sending jolts of agony up her arm with every movement. She could hear coughing from the direction of the station master's office, and found Wanya Hugh and Samuel Briggs huddled beside Patrick Kelly, who was making a valiant but futile attempt to beat back the advancing flames with a soaked blanket. "This way." Clara shouted over the roar of the fire, leading them toward what she hoped was a rear exit that would take them away from the gun battle raging outside. But as they reached the back door of the burning building, it burst inward to reveal Jed Cutter with a smoking revolver in his hand and murder blazing in his eyes. The foreman's face was streaked with soot and blood, his clothes torn from his desperate fight against overwhelming federal forces. But he was still armed and clearly determined to eliminate the witnesses who could testify against his criminal organization. "You people have caused me nothing but trouble since this whole mess started," he snarled, raising his weapon toward Clara with obvious intent to kill her where she stood. "Should have minded your own business instead of sticking your nose into affairs that don't concern outsiders." The gunshot that followed was deafeningly loud in the confined space of the burning building. But it was Cutter who staggered backward with shock and pain, rather than Clara falling forward with a fatal wound. Behind the surprised foreman stood young Hugh, clutching a heavy iron wrench he had grabbed from Kelly's tool collection, with hands that shook from adrenaline and desperate determination. The boy had struck Cutter in the back of the head, with all the strength his small body could muster, demonstrating the kind of raw courage that comes from having witnessed his father's murder and having nothing left to lose. After months of hiding and living in fear, Hugh had found the determination to fight back against the men who had destroyed his family and stolen his childhood. But even as Cutter fell to his knees, stunned but not unconscious, Clara saw him reaching for a second pistol hidden in his boot, his eyes fixed on Hugh with murderous intent that transcended rational thought. The man was going to kill a child in cold blood, and there was no time for anyone else to intervene. Clara grabbed the fallen wrench and brought it down on Cutter's wrist, just as he cleared leather the impact sending his backup weapon spinning away, across the wooden floor with a metallic clatter. This time the foreman collapsed completely, finally unconscious from the combined blows to his head, and the realization that his last desperate gambit had failed as thoroughly as all the others. Outside, the battle was reaching its inevitable climax as federal reinforcements arrived with overwhelming force and professional competence. The trains carrying additional marshals and army troops had reached the depot, and uniformed soldiers were surrounding the area with military precision that spoke to extensive experience in handling civil disturbances and territorial conflicts. Sykes found himself caught between Thompson's original team and the new arrivals, his escape routes completely cut off, and his remaining followers deserting him in growing numbers as the futility of continued resistance became undeniable. But instead of surrendering to face justice through proper legal channels, the corrupt deputy sheriff made one final suicidal decision that would define his legacy forever. "If I'm going down for this," he screamed with the voice of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him, "I'm taking that meddling woman with me." Sykes broke from his defensive position, with his revolver blazing, charging directly toward Clara as she emerged from the burning depot with smoke-stained clothes and blood on her hands. She raised Cutter's captured weapon in her own defense, but her injured wrist made accurate shooting nearly impossible, and she knew she wouldn't be able to stop his attack before he reached her position. It was Zaltana who stepped into Sykes's path without hesitation, moving with the fluid grace of a natural warrior, despite his peaceful profession as a carpenter and craftsman. The two men collided with tremendous force, Sykes's revolver spinning away across the depot platform as they crashed to the wooden planks in a desperate struggle that would determine the fate of everyone present. Clara watched in terror as they fought with life-or-death intensity, rolling and grappling on the rough wooden surface while flames crackled in the background and federal forces moved to secure the area. Sykes was younger and perhaps physically stronger, but Zaltana possessed the calm strength that comes from fighting to protect others rather than preserving one's own life. And that made all the difference in the final accounting. But then, in a moment that seemed to freeze time itself, Clara saw Sykes draw a hidden knife from his boot, the blade gleaming in the firelight as he raised it toward Zaltana's exposed back in a killing stroke that would end the fight permanently and eliminate the man who had become the most important person in her life. Without thinking, Clara lunged forward and grabbed Sykes's wrist, her own injured arm screaming with agony as she fought to deflect the blow that would have murdered the man she had come to love. Her interference gave Zaltana the opening he needed to drive his elbow into Sykes's solar plexus, driving the breath from the corrupt lawman's lungs and ending his ability to continue the fight. The violent struggle concluded abruptly when Sykes's head struck one of the platform's iron support posts with a sickening sound that echoed across the depot yard. He went completely limp, his body relaxing into unconsciousness as federal marshals moved in quickly to secure him with iron shackles that would ensure he lived to face trial for his extensive crimes. "Is he dead?" Clara asked as Thompson checked Sykes's pulse with professional efficiency. "No, just unconscious," the marshal replied with satisfaction. "He'll live to stand trial for treason murder and conspiracy against the United States government, which is considerably more mercy than he showed any of his victims over the years." But even as the gunfight ended and federal officers rounded up the surviving members of the criminal conspiracy, Clara noticed something that would have been amusing under different circumstances. Jed Cutter, regaining consciousness inside the depot building, was not trying to escape or resist arrest. Instead, he was shouting desperate offers to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for leniency. "I'll tell you everything." Cutter yelled as soldiers dragged him from the smoky building. "Sykes forced me into this. I got evidence against Dodd and Governor Whitmore hidden away. I can give you everything you need to bring down the whole network." The betrayal was as swift as it was complete. Faced with the certainty of execution or life imprisonment, Cutter was abandoning his former partners without hesitation or apparent remorse. There was no honor among these particular thieves. And Clara realized that his testimony would probably be crucial in exposing the full extent of the conspiracy that had terrorized the territory for years. Clara sank to her knees beside Zoltana, who was sitting up slowly with blood trickling from a split lip where Sykes had managed to land a solid blow during their desperate struggle. Despite his injuries, his first concern was for her safety and well-being, rather than his own condition. "Are you badly hurt?" he asked, reaching out to check her fractured wrist with gentle hands that had become so familiar and comforting over the past few days. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice shook with delayed reaction to all the violence and terror they had survived together. "Thanks to you, again and always." As she looked at his battered face and thought about everything they had endured together since sharing that doomed mail sleigh in the mountain blizzard, Clara realized that something profound and permanent had changed between them during their desperate flight from corruption and death. What had begun as two strangers thrown together by circumstance had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than mere survival cooperation. Zoltana had repeatedly risked his life to protect hers, had trusted her judgment. In crucial moments, had never once made her feel like a burden, despite her injuries and limitations. And she had fought beside him, had found courage she didn't know she possessed, had discovered that partnership could be both intensely practical and deeply personal. Around them, federal officers were efficiently mopping up the remnants of Sykes's criminal organization, while firefighters worked to control the blaze that was consuming parts of the depot building. The evidence Clara had risked her life to preserve was safe in Marshal Thompson's hands, destined for Washington, where it would trigger investigations that would reshape territorial governance throughout the American West. But as Zoltana's strong, calloused hand closed gently over hers, with the tenderness of someone who had learned to value what truly mattered, Clara understood that they had preserved something even more valuable than the documents that would send evil men to prison. They had found each other in the midst of chaos, and violence had forged a bond that would endure long after the trials and headlines were forgotten. The battle for justice was finally over, but their story together was just beginning to unfold in ways that neither of them could have expected when old Pete's mail sleigh first began sliding toward disaster in Granitic Pass. They had survived everything the frontier could throw at them, and now they faced the most challenging adventure of all, building a life together in a world where love was possible, even in the shadow of the gallows.